Do you have any favorite concept albums that aren't the Beatles? Or?
Yeah, I think Dark Side of the Moon's a great album.
For more than 60 years, Paul McCartney has stood as one of music's most enduring and influential figures. The man who wrote Yesterday and Let It Be turned simple melodies into timeless art, making songwriting seem as natural as breathing. But behind every perfect hook and unforgettable chorus was a dedicated student who never stopped learning from the masters who came before him. Paul McCartney didn't just create music in a vacuum, he absorbed everything around him, studying the architects of sound who built the foundation of modern music, the rebels who broke every rule in the book, and the dreamers who constructed entire cathedrals from nothing but notes and passion. Throughout his career, Paul has spoken about certain albums that held special significance for him. These weren't just records he enjoyed or admired from a distance, they were sacred texts, untouchable standards that he spent his entire lifetime trying to reach. These 8 albums represent more than just his favorite music. They were the blueprints that shaped his artistic vision, the benchmarks against which he measured his own work, and the inspiration that drove him to keep pushing boundaries even after he'd already changed the world. This is the story of those albums and how they molded the artist who would go on to shape everything that followed. The first album that left an indelible mark on young Paul McCartney was Here's Little Richard, released in 1957. This record wasn't just music, it was a sonic earthquake that shook the foundations of everything Paul thought he knew about what music could be. Little Richard's piano didn't politely accompany his voice, it attacked with ferocious energy. His vocals didn't simply carry the melody, they exploded with a force that couldn't be contained. When Paul sat in his Liverpool living room and first heard this album, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what was possible in popular music. This music was dangerous, it was unpolite and unsafe in the best possible way. It represented freedom wrapped up in beautiful chaos. Paul later recalled that Little Richard taught him music could be simultaneously dangerous and joyful, 2 qualities that seemed contradictory but somehow worked together perfectly. Songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Rip It Up weren't just catchy tunes, they were declarations of war against boredom and conformity. Every single note seemed soaked in sweat in rebellion. The screaming vocal that Paul would later use on several Beatles records was actually his impression of Little Richard's raw, uninhibited style. What fascinated Paul most was the relentless energy Little Richard brought to every performance. He never coasted or held back. He screamed himself hoarse on every single track, and somehow it all felt like an expression of pure love for the music. The piano pounded with unstoppable force, while the band raced to keep up with the frenetic pace. Yet underneath all that apparent chaos was remarkable precision. Little Richard knew exactly what he was doing. He represented controlled wildness, disciplined insanity. That paradox captured Paul's imagination completely. Here's Little Richard was the first album that made Paul want to truly perform, not just play music, but command a stage, move bodies, and blow minds. When the Beatles later covered Long Tall Sally, Paul channeled that same raw, unfiltered joy. He screamed until his throat burned because Little Richard had taught him that sometimes music isn't about being pretty or polished, sometimes it's simply about being alive. The second transformative album was Elvis's self-titled debut from 1956. This was the spark that started everything for Paul. He was just 14 years old when this record dropped, hungry for something he couldn't quite name or define. Then he heard Elvis's voice, and everything changed. It was velvet wrapped around danger, charm soaked in rebellion. Elvis didn't just sing songs, he seduced listeners. Paul, like millions of others around the world, surrendered completely to that magnetic presence. The album was a wild riot of influences, blending gospel, blues, country, and rock together with a confidence that felt almost illegal. Elvis made it all sound effortless and easy, as if he'd simply woken up one morning and casually decided to change the world before breakfast. Paul studied that apparent ease carefully. He wanted to capture that quality of effortlessness in his own work, and he chased it for the rest of his life. What Paul admired most about Elvis was the versatility and control of his voice. It could do anything. On Love Me Tender, it was soft as a whisper, while on Shake, Rattle, and Roll, it was raw as gravel. Elvis had complete control over his instrument, but he hid that technical mastery brilliantly. He made you think he was just being himself, that this was all natural talent flowing out without effort. That authenticity, whether real or manufactured, was magnetic. Paul learned from Elvis that the best performances don't feel like performances at all. They feel like confessions, like the artist is revealing their true self. The third crucial album was Chuck Berry's After School Session from 1957. Chuck Berry made storytelling in popular music look like an exact science. This album was a masterclass in economy and efficiency. Every single line mattered. Every rhyme landed perfectly. Chuck didn't waste a single word in his carefully crafted narratives. Paul, who would go on to write some of the tightest, most efficient pop songs in music history, took extensive notes. This was the blueprint for how to say everything you needed to say in just 3 minutes and make it last forever. Songs like School Days, Too Much Monkey Business, and Brown-Eyed Handsome Man documented teenage life with incredible wit and precision. Chuck wrote about a world that most adults completely ignored. He captured the frustration of school, the incredible thrill of freedom, and the fundamental need to move, to dance, to truly live. Paul heard those songs and recognized them as poetry disguised as rock and roll. Chuck wasn't just entertaining his audience, he was carefully archiving an entire generation's experience. The guitar work on the album was genuinely revolutionary. Chuck's riffs were clean, sharp, and utterly unforgettable. They didn't just accompany the songs, they were integral parts of the songs themselves. Paul, who played bass, understood musical structure deeply. He knew that a truly great riff could carry an entire composition. Chuck Berry proved that theory. His guitar lines were so strong and memorable that you could hum them like melodies. Paul absorbed that lesson completely. He built his own bass lines with the same clarity and purpose, understanding that every instrumental part needed to justify its existence. The fourth album that shaped Paul's musical worldview was The Chirping Crickets by Buddy Holly and the Crickets, released in 1957. This one was deeply personal for Paul. Buddy Holly wasn't flashy or showy. He didn't scream or gyrate on stage. He wore glasses and looked like a regular kid from Texas. But when he sang and played, something magical happened. The Chirping Crickets was simplicity elevated to genius. Paul, who shared Buddy's natural gift for melody, saw himself reflected in those grooves. Buddy was the songwriter's songwriter, living proof that you didn't need gimmicks or tricks, you just needed genuinely good songs. That'll Be the Day, Not Fade Away, and Oh Boy weren't complicated compositions. They were perfect. 3 chords, honest and direct lyrics in melodies that stuck in your head like glue. Buddy Holly understood something essential about popular music. Emotion doesn't require complexity, it requires truth and authenticity. Paul learned that lesson early in his career and never forgot it. Yesterday uses just 3 chords, Let It Be uses 4. When simplicity is executed correctly, it becomes unstoppable. Buddy was also a genuine pioneer in ways that went beyond his songwriting. He wrote his own songs instead of relying on professional songwriters. He produced his own records instead of letting others control his sound. He maintained creative control over his music. In the late 1950s, that level of artistic independence was extremely rare. Most popular artists were essentially puppets controlled by their labels and producers. Buddy was a true craftsman who controlled his own destiny. Paul admired that independence tremendously. When the Beatles later fought their own battles for creative control, they were following Buddy Holly's pioneering example. When Paul eventually started producing himself, he was honoring Buddy's legacy. The tragedy of Buddy's death in a plane crash in 1959 hit Paul particularly hard. Buddy was only 22 years old, gone at the absolute peak of his creative powers. But the music remained. That'll Be the Day still sounded perfect decades after it was recorded. Paul carried that grief and that deep admiration throughout his entire career. He even bought the publishing rights to Buddy's catalog, not to profit from them, but to protect Buddy's legacy and ensure the world would never forget his contributions. The fifth influential album was Motown's Greatest Hits, a compilation that represented everything Motown Records stood for. Motown was the factory Paul wished he could have owned, though not a factory producing products, but one producing absolute perfection. Every song released by Motown was crafted with surgical precision. The bass lines locked in tight, the harmonies shimmered and glowed, the production quality was consistently brilliant. Berry Gordy built an entire empire based on rigorous quality control. Paul studied every Motown release like it was scripture, learning that hit records weren't happy accidents, they were carefully designed blueprints executed flawlessly. Songs like My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and Reach Out, I'll Be There weren't just songs, they were monuments to what popular music could achieve. Paul listened especially carefully to the bass lines. James Jamerson, Motown's legendary bass player, approached his instrument like a composer rather than a rhythm section member. His bass parts didn't just keep time, they told complete stories. Paul absorbed that compositional approach to the bass. His bass lines on songs like Come Together, Something, and Drive My Car weren't simply background noise providing foundation, they were architectural elements that shaped the entire song. Motown also taught Paul invaluable lessons about arrangement. Every single instrument in a Motown production had a clear purpose. Nothing was wasted or unnecessary. The tambourine hit precisely on the 2 and 4 beats. The string section swelled at exactly the right moments to maximize emotional impact. The backing vocals answered the lead vocal like participants in a conversation. It was mathematical in its precision, but it somehow still felt full of soul and humanity. That delicate balance between technical precision and emotional warmth became one of Paul's lifelong obsessions. He wanted to create songs that were simultaneously perfect and deeply human. The fifth influential album was the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds from 1966. When this album arrived, Paul was already a Beatle, already successful beyond most people's wildest dreams, already confident in his abilities. Then he heard what Brian Wilson had accomplished, and suddenly he felt like a student again. Pet Sounds wasn't just another album, it was a direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. Brian had pushed the boundaries of what popular music could be and achieve. Paul, competitive to his very core, knew he had to respond. Songs like God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times were heartbreak wrapped in stunning beauty. Brian Wilson took sadness and somehow made it sound like heaven itself. The arrangements were fully orchestral, lush and impossibly detailed. Pet Sounds wasn't simply recorded in a studio, it was carefully sculpted, with every single note placed with clear intention and every harmony stacked with meticulous care. Paul heard it and immediately thought the Beatles had to go deeper into their own explorations. What impressed Paul most about Pet Sounds was Brian Wilson's remarkable courage. The Beach Boys were known primarily for surf rock and songs about cars and California fun. Pet Sounds was introspective, melancholic, and emotionally vulnerable in ways that were completely unexpected. Brian risked everything he'd built to make this album, and it wasn't an immediate commercial smash. It confused many listeners and radio programmers, but Paul understood it immediately and completely. He recognized that truly great art sometimes meant alienating your existing audience, that playing it safe was the enemy of genuine genius. Pet Sounds directly inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul has admitted this connection openly and proudly. He heard what Brian accomplished and wanted to go even further. The Beatles responded with an album that combined concept, theater, and wild experimentation all at once. But it all started with Pet Sounds, with Brian Wilson demonstrating to Paul that the recording studio wasn't just a tool for capturing performances. The studio itself was an instrument, and if you learned to play that instrument correctly, you could build entire worlds. The seventh album that shaped Paul's artistic vision was John Coltrane's A Love Supreme from 1965. Paul didn't limit his listening to rock music, he absorbed everything he could find. When A Love Supreme was released, Paul heard something that felt genuinely sacred. John Coltrane wasn't writing conventional songs. He was channeling something higher and more profound. This was jazz as prayer, music as a spiritual journey toward enlightenment. Paul, who would later write deeply spiritual songs like Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road, understood that music could touch something divine. A Love Supreme is structured as a four-part suite. It's complex, intense, and constantly searching for meaning. Coltrane's saxophone doesn't just play notes on a page. It asks fundamental questions about existence. It cries out, it pleads, it reaches desperately for something beyond ordinary language. Paul listened carefully and realized that music didn't necessarily need words to communicate profound truths. Sometimes the purest expression was purely instrumental. That understanding influenced his decision to write Eleanor Rigby with a string arrangement. It's why he used full orchestras on Beatles records. Coltrane showed him that emotion could live entirely within the arrangement itself. What Paul admired most about Coltrane was his total commitment to his artistic vision. A Love Supreme wasn't easy or comfortable to listen to. It demanded complete attention from the listener. It required patience and a willingness to sit with difficult emotions. But if you gave it the time and attention it deserved, it rewarded you with something approaching transcendence. Paul carried that lesson directly into his own work. Not every song had to be a potential single. Not every melody had to be immediately obvious or accessible. Sometimes depth and substance mattered more than instant accessibility. The eighth and final album that served as Paul's North Star was Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions from 1973. This was mastery in its purest form, undeniable and complete. When Inner Visions was released, Paul was deep into his Wings period, working hard to prove he could achieve success without the Beatles. Then Stevie Wonder released an album that did absolutely everything. Writing, producing, performing, arranging, Stevie handled it all. And he did it all perfectly. Paul listened and thought to himself that this was what complete artistry looked like when pushed to its absolute limit. Songs like Living for the City, Higher Ground, Golden Lady, and Visions were each powerful statements in their own right. Stevie sang about social justice, spirituality, love, and struggle with equal passion and insight. The production was simultaneously warm, funky, and futuristic. The Moog synthesizers added rich texture without feeling like gimmicks. The rhythms were technically tight, but felt loose and natural. Everything felt vibrantly alive and organic, and somehow it was all Stevie, one man building an entire universe from his singular vision. What Paul admired most was Stevie's fearlessness in the face of every obstacle. He was blind, but he saw more clearly than most sighted people. He was a pop star, but he absolutely refused to make shallow or meaningless music. Inner Visions tackled poverty, inequality, and faith without ever becoming preachy or didactic. It was protest music that made you want to groove. It was spiritual music that made you want to dance. That perfect balance between being serious without becoming heavy was something Paul always chased in his own work. Stevie Wonder showed Paul the future of music could and should be. An artist who controlled every single aspect of their work, who refused to compromise their vision, who pushed technology forward while keeping the essential soul completely intact. Paul spent the rest of his career trying to match that impossible standard, not to copy Stevie's approach, but to honor it by pursuing his own version of that same completeness. Inner Visions was untouchable in Paul's mind, not because it was technically perfect, but because it was absolutely complete. And completeness, Paul learned through years of study and practice, was the highest possible form of art. Paul McCartney spent more than 60 years chasing perfection in his music. These 8 albums were his North Stars, the standards he could never quite reach, but never stopped pursuing with every fiber of his being. True greatness is never born in isolation. It's always built on the shoulders of giants who came before, who showed the way and proved what was possible.
These albums and the artists who created them gave Paul his foundation, his education, and his eternal inspiration. They challenged him to be better, to dig deeper, to never settle for easy answers or comfortable choices. And in studying them, absorbing them, and responding to them, Paul McCartney became the artist that would inspire countless others in exactly the same way.